Now I turn to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected in 1932, but he took power in 1933. And this was a guy who was in there right up to, the end of World War II. This is a guy who had a longer tenure than any president in American history. It was after FDR they decided to sort of limit presidents to 2 terms. And FDR was I won't say he was a notorious racist by intention, but he was a notorious racist in the effect of his actions. So he continues the strain of bigotry that began with Andrew Jackson, continued with others, all the way through Wilson, and continued with FDR. Now, a lot of this is suppressed in progressive historiography, which is, lionizes FDR. So if they mention what I'm about to tell you, they tend to minimize it. Number one, FDR cut deals with racist Democrats in his own party to suppress anti-lynching laws. Number two, FDR cut similar deals also with racists in the Democratic Party to cut blacks out of New Deal programs. Now, he didn't say blacks, he just said, well, we're going to exempt categories like domestic service or farm labor from New Deal benefits, knowing that blacks were heavily concentrated in those areas. So, in other words, FDR was willing to work with the worst elements of his own party. He appointed, by the way, Hugo Black, who was a notorious lawyer for the Ku Klux Klan, one of the speakers at regular Klan rallies. FDR put him on the Supreme Court, by the way, knowing full well what his background was. And a lot of the things that we talk about today trace back to FDR. I'm going to get to those in a moment, but before I do, I want to show you a telling clip about the fact that FDR, when he came to power in America, there was another guy who came to power in Germany, Hitler. And although, again, this is something that you won't find in the textbooks, you won't find it in Wikipedia, nevertheless, there it is documented in the historical record, a kind of weird affinity between the Nazis over there and the FDR Democrats over here. Listen.
Hitler came to power in 1933. On the other side of the Atlantic, another charismatic leader, FDR, was elected. The 2 men recognized each other as fellow progressives. Here's what the Nazi newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, said of the FDR administration. We too, as German National Socialists, are looking toward America. The Nazi paper congratulated FDR for replacing the uninhibited frenzy of market speculation with the adoption of National Socialist strains of thought. Of FDR's New Deal, the Völkischer Beobachter said, "We fear only the possibility that it might fail."
This clip, by the way, is from the movie Death of a Nation. And it's very revealing because it shows that the Nazis understood that A, FDR was on the left, B, they were on the left. They were trying to do sort of the same thing. And so we can look back and see Nazism, communism, and progressivism as sister movements on the left that all developed. They were all collectivist movements, movements of state power that developed around the same time. They had some rivalries, but they were ideologically on the same side of the aisle nevertheless. Now, the key point with FDR is he was the inventor of, you could call it the modern doctrine of rights. Today, when you hear AOC or Bernie Sanders or Biden, they keep talking about things that people want as rights. There's a right to health care. There's a right to this. There's a right to that. People have a right. And the question becomes, where does this right come from? And I want to say, it certainly doesn't come from the Constitution, which enumerates none of these rights. But I want to say it comes from FDR. FDR, by the way, gave a speech. This was January 11th, 1944. It is sometimes known as a speech outlining, and he called it this, the Second Bill of Rights. So basically, FDR wants to rewrite the Constitution by declaring a second Bill of Rights that's not in the Bill of Rights. And let's look at what these rights are. Quote, he says that every American is entitled to, quote, a useful and remunerative job, a right to a job. Second, the opportunity to, quote, earn enough to provide adequate food, clothing, and recreation, to, quote, a decent home, to quote adequate medical care, healthcare here as a right, to quote a good education, to quote adequate protection in old age and retirement. He even goes on to say that people have the right to quote freedom from fear. Fear itself becomes a threat, and the right to be free from fear is a right. Now, it's important to think for a moment about how antithetical this whole framework, not just the rights themselves, but the underlying philosophy of the rights, is from the American founders. So let's turn to the founding for a moment. When we turn to the Bill of Rights, pretty much every phrase begins like this: Congress shall make no law. So Congress shall make no law restricting freedom of the press. Congress shall make no law restricting free speech. Congress shall make no law restricting freedom of religion, and on it goes. So rights are seen as limitations on the government. By limiting the power of the government, we secure our rights. And the government is seen as the enemy of rights. But notice that for FDR, it's the opposite. Suddenly, government becomes the friend of rights. Government becomes the guarantor of rights. You cannot have these rights without the government. So the philosophy of big government, which would later expand promiscuously. I mean, and FDR, by the way, was there first. He couldn't expand it that much, but he thought of it. In fact, he wanted tax rates of up to 100%. He thought above a certain income, take everything that you make. So this was FDR. So the Democrats, you can say in a way, when they're moving in a direction, they are moving toward a vision, a kind of Platonic idea, a utopia that FDR himself envisioned. Think about it. FDR tried to pack the court. Biden now has a commission aimed at, quote, packing the court. So FDR, in a sense, was the tyrant in chief, not in the sense that he realized the vision, but he laid it out. And he was not afraid to go there, and he hated big business. He once said something to the effect in his Madison Square Garden speech. He goes, "Many of you hate me, and I welcome your hatred." So if we're worried about divisive rhetoric, demonizing your opponents, thinking of people who don't agree with you as people who should sort of be run out of the country, tyrannized, harassed by the government, FDR is your man. This was a very bad guy. And anyone who has fond memories of FDR needs to sort of clean those out of your head. Yes, he played a role in America winning World War II, but in retrospect, here was also a guy who was, you almost say, the author of the modern Democratic Party, and of a party that would become systematically wedded to big government and inimical, harmful to personal liberty.